Hey, hope you were well. Thought we'd start by talking about one of probably the most fundamental principle when it comes to understanding Scripture. I mentioned we're going to probably talking about how we approach and read Scripture. As we do that, one of the things we have to remember is we are Christians, which seems sort of obvious and should go without saying, but unfortunately the implications of that don't always. The term Christian was actually a derogatory term that the pagans, those outside the Christian faith, started using for the people who are following Jesus, and it means little Christ. And as that started to be used, Christians looked at that and said, hey, we like that, and they started to take that as their moniker, as their name. And the reason, of course, is that we are trying to be like Christ, right? We want to be little Christ, little Jesuses walking around. And so when we think about Scripture and the story that God has been telling for thousands of years and the one that we are trying to live into, we need to remember that Jesus is the key. He is the fulcrum, the center point of that whole narrative. And so when we come to understand and read the text, we need to do that through the lens of Jesus. Right? So too often we come to the text and we go to a letter of the New Testament, so one of Paul's or James or John's or the letter of Hebrews, and we start there and we try to understand who Jesus is out of those letters. Or sometimes we go to the Old Testament and we start to think about who God is, who God has revealed himself to be in that text. And we need to remember, we can't forget that Jesus is God's self-revelation, right? And Jesus says that if you've seen him, if you know him, you've known the Father. The writer of Hebrews tells us that he is the exact imprint of God's being. And so when you want to know what God is like, you look to Jesus. Jesus first, right? So what does holy look like? Well, it looks like Jesus. What does love look like? It looks like Jesus. What does purity and righteousness look like? It's Jesus, right? And that is the way we need to approach the text. So Jesus first. We can get messed up if we go the other way around. We always need to allow Jesus to be the one who interprets and sets the parameters through which we then go and understand the rest of the text. And for us as Christians living on this side of Jesus, that means as we approach the Old Testament, for example, we start with Jesus and we read backwards, right? So chronologically, of course, the Old Testament was first, right? And so the people of God are working in the world, living with God. God's working through them to renew the whole world, ultimately through Jesus. And so it's marching towards Jesus. And without the lens of Jesus, there's one way to understand that text, one way to read it, a very, very Jewish historical way. But as Christians, and this is the genius of Paul, is in light of who Jesus is, we go back and we re-understand all of those stories. So Paul, for example, will re-understand what the temple means, what the sacrifices mean and meant and mean now, what the priesthood means, and all of that gets re-understood around the person of Jesus. So Jesus is what we call the hermeneutical key. He is the fulcrum or the lens through which we need to see everything else. And so if you are reading text and you have questions or you have a gnawing sense that something you're reading is contradicting something else you're reading, or perhaps something that Jesus says, well, then we're not reading it, understanding it right. We need to go back to Jesus and say, okay, what did Jesus say about this topic or issue? And then allow that to be our foundation, and then we let Paul or James or John sort of tweak and help us understand what Jesus was saying. But Jesus is the foundation. You don't first go to Paul or to anyone else. You go to Jesus and his words. So hope that's clear. If you got any questions, drop them in the comments, send a message. If you want to know anything else, or you got anything else eating at you that you want clarity on, please get a hold of us. See you next time.